after a 16-year-old girl who resided with her parents and younger sisters was discovered dead in her room in the morning. The police quickly identified it as a murder case. Surprisingly, none of her family members heard anything unusual that night. It took 31 years to finally crack the case, catching everyone off guard. Born on March 24, 1973, in Kansas City, Missouri, Fawn Cox was the eldest of 3 daughters in the family. Living in a modest 2-story house in a rough neighborhood, she had been helping her parents care for her younger siblings since a young age. Fawn was a regular churchgoer and enjoyed swimming. At 16, she took up a part-time job at a local amusement park to support her financially struggling family. During the summer of 1989, she spent most of her time working at the park, selling tickets at the cash register. On the evening of Wednesday, July 26th, Fawn finished her shift around 10 p.m. and her mother and younger sister picked her up. Due to the late hour, they drove her home. Upon returning, Fawn went straight to bed as she had work the next morning. She slept alone in her room on the 2nd floor, while her sisters were elsewhere in the house. The following morning, the family was alarmed by the sound of Fawn's alarm clock, which she didn't switch off. Her mother and younger sister went to her room, only to discover a tragic scene. Fawn was found lifeless on the bed, her neck visibly bruised, with no pulse. Her parents immediately called for an ambulance, but unfortunately it was too late to save her. It became evident that Fawn had passed away hours before, and upon further examination, medical experts determined that she had been strangled and abused from the beginning. This tragic incident posed a significant challenge for the police, as they embarked on a difficult investigation. Despite the fact that Fawn was killed in her own room, which had poor soundproofing in their small house, her parents and sister heard no signs of struggle. However, there was a plausible explanation for this peculiar silence. The old and noisy air conditioner on the 1st floor drowned out any other sounds within the house. The only unusual occurrence that night was noticed by Fawn's sister, who observed their pregnant poodle behaving anxiously and barking. Regrettably, they did not pay much attention to it at the time. Upon examining the crime scene, the police made several significant discoveries. They theorized that the attacker or group had gained entry through a 2nd-story window overlooking the backyard. Adjacent to the house, there was an old trailer that could have been used to climb up to the canopy of the outbuilding, which was nearly level with the window. The window itself had been left open due to the absence of air conditioning on the 2nd floor, as they had to find a way to combat the heat. Inside Fawn's room, experts found crucial clues that would aid in their investigation. They discovered a few short hairs, small blood stains, and traces of semen on her bedsheet. All of these pieces of evidence were sent to the lab for analysis. Additionally, several items were reported missing from the house, including radios, a Nintendo game console, and a stereo recorder. Interestingly, some of these items were found on the ground outside the house, suggesting that the burglar had thrown them out the window but inexplicably left them behind. Detectives also discovered that several items had been taken from a closet in an adjacent room on the 2nd floor. They suspected the culprit had hidden in that closet while waiting for everyone in the house to fall asleep. Typically, Fawn's sister slept in that room, but not on that particular night, hence, no one noticed the missing items. Another peculiar clue found by the police was an old army cap in Fawn's room. Her family members claimed they had never seen her wear it, leading detectives to believe the killer may have left it behind accidentally. Despite the substantial evidence, the police struggled to swiftly identify the suspects. The challenge stemmed from the fact that in 1989, DNA forensics was not as advanced, and there were no widespread genetic databases available at the time. Detective Benjamin Caldwell, who was in charge of the case, proposed a theory on what might have occurred. He suggested that there could have been multiple attackers who were familiar with the house. These individuals not only knew how to access the 2nd floor through the backyard in complete darkness, but they also seemed to be well acquainted with the layout of the rooms. The next course of action for the police was to seek out witnesses. They interviewed neighbors, friends, and relatives of Fawn, but the results were inconclusive. The detectives faced a significant challenge. The neighborhood, where the house was situated, was impoverished and crime-ridden. Various criminal groups operated there, making it difficult to bring perpetrators to justice. A month after Fawn's tragic death, progress was finally made in the case. The police received information from a witness that led them to 3 suspects. This witness possessed key details that had not been disclosed by the police, lending credibility to their account. The suspects, 3 teenagers, one of whom was in the same class as Fawn, were apprehended and interrogated, but they all denied any involvement in the crime. During the search of their residences, the police discovered stolen items from the victim's room, which provided sufficient evidence to charge all 3 individuals with murder. However, the detectives faced disappointment on 2 fronts. Firstly, the witness suddenly recanted their statement and ceased cooperation with the police. Secondly, the DNA analysis conducted on blood, hair, and semen found at the crime scene did not definitively match the suspect's samples. At that time, experts were unable to establish an exact match, and the test results yielded questionable outcomes, failing to confirm either a complete match or a definite mismatch. Despite these setbacks, the police managed to gather valuable information from one of the detainees during an interrogation. He confessed to breaking into Fawn's house that night in the company of other boys and stealing various items. He provided intricate details, including his method of accessing the 2nd floor through the canopy. Notably, he mentioned throwing a tape recorder out the window, resulting in the handle detaching. The boy disclosed that he concealed the handle under a nearby bush, and indeed, the police discovered the item in that exact location. However, the young man swiftly retracted his statement and ceased cooperation with the investigation, rendering his confession inadmissible in court. Consequently, the police were compelled to release the suspects, leading to a standstill in the investigation. It is highly likely that the witnesses were intimidated, and without their testimony in court, the case faced significant challenges. The only known outcome was that one of the individuals spent 8 months in jail for stealing items from Fawn's house. Subsequently, the case was shelved for an extended period, with the police only reopening the investigation in the early 2000s. Their initial step involved uploading DNA samples from the crime scene to the CODIS database, which had been established several years prior and contained DNA profiles of individuals convicted of serious crimes. Unfortunately, no matches were found for the perpetrator of the Fawn murder. The establishment of this database was a direct outcome of significant scientific progress in the field of DNA research. It enabled law enforcement to retrieve DNA samples from the initial 3 suspects and carry out more sophisticated analyses. Surprisingly, experts definitively concluded that the hair, semen, and blood did not match any of the suspects. This was particularly puzzling considering that the suspects were found in possession of Fawn's belongings. Detectives theorized that the 3 individuals had indeed burglarized her home at night, but there was an additional person among them. He was the one responsible for the assault and murder of the girl. This development led to further inquiries. Was it possible that 4 perpetrators had entered the residence undetected, committed the crime, and then left without a trace? The authorities remained unable to provide an answer to this question. Consequently, the investigation once again reached a standstill. As time passed, the Fawn family's hope of finding resolution dwindled. They remained convinced that the 3 suspects had been present in their home that fateful night and could identify the culprit, yet chose not to do so. The key to uncovering the truth lay in a DNA sample preserved at the police laboratory. In 2018, a significant event occurred. Amber, Fawn's younger sister, disclosed some unsettling information about the incident. She shared previously unknown details with the public on a prominent American forum dedicated to unsolved crimes. Over the course of 2 decades, the forum had established a reputation for reliability, and its members had assisted law enforcement in solving numerous high-profile cases. Amber's identity was verified, lending credibility to her post. She worked as a nanny during the weekdays and was only at home on weekends. She slept in the very room on the 2nd floor through which the intruders had gained entry. Thus, it would have been impossible for them to go unnoticed. Moreover, surveillance was conducted on the house while waiting for Fawn's mother and younger sister to pick her up from work. Despite these efforts, Amber's account did not bring the investigation any closer to resolution. However, by 2018, advancements in DNA research had progressed significantly. Numerous cold cases were being solved due to the utilization of new analytical tools. Fawn's family observed this progress and questioned why the authorities were not expediting the reopening of the murder case. Despite their continuous communication with detectives, the response remained the same: extensive DNA testing required funding, and the police were handling multiple cases. Consequently, the family had no choice but to wait for their turn and the necessary financial support. Taking matters into their own hands, they launched a fundraising campaign in 2019 to cover the costs of DNA analysis and offered a substantial reward for any information leading to the apprehension of the culprits. The case received significant media attention, prompting an outpouring of support from concerned individuals. Although the family quickly raised the required funds, their hopes were dashed when the police declined to proceed with the investigation funded by the victims' relatives. The lead detective highlighted the inherent challenges in such a scenario, emphasizing the impracticality of allowing certain families to expedite testing and results through financial means. With only a few laboratories worldwide equipped to conduct advanced DNA analysis, the overwhelming demand posed a significant resource constraint. Parabon Nanolabs, the top company in this field, has been making significant strides in DNA research. They have the ability to identify a person's relatives from the tiniest genetic samples and even create an approximate portrait of the DNA owner. This lab was tasked with analyzing the samples found in Fawn's bedroom on the night of her murder. Fawn's family believed that the authorities were dragging their feet on the case due to their low socioeconomic status and the neighborhood they lived in. In an interview, Sister Fawn expressed her frustration, stating that if the victim had come from a wealthy or influential family, the investigation would have been expedited. Finally, in late 2020, a breakthrough occurred with the help of Federal Bureau of Investigation funding. The police sent the DNA samples from Fawn's room to a lab for analysis. The focus was on a semen sample found at the crime scene. In November 2020, they identified the individual to whom the DNA belonged: Fawn's cousin, Donald Cox. This revelation came as a shock to the family, as Donald had a troubled past and had been involved in criminal activities. Unfortunately, DNA samples were not routinely taken from criminals during that time, which could have led to an earlier resolution of the case. Donald passed away in 2006, but his death was investigated under suspicious circumstances, leading to the preservation of his DNA sample. The man in this case was identified as a victim rather than a perpetrator, which is why his information was not entered into the Federal Bureau of Investigation database. After the experts informed the police of their discovery, they were able to match the sample with the semen found at the murder scene, resulting in a 100% match. Despite the significance of this finding, the family members have finally received an answer to a question that has haunted them for over 3 decades. However, there was still a crucial aspect of the story that needed to be addressed. A substantial amount of evidence pointed towards the 3 original suspects being present at the Fawn house on the night of the murder. It was now evident how the perpetrators were so familiar with the house and the family's routines. Donald, a frequent visitor, was well acquainted with all the details. Nevertheless, the case was closed by the police, and no further charges were brought against the 3 men. Sister Fawn expressed her belief that attempting to extract a confession from them would serve no purpose. Even if the suspects were in the house that night, they might not have witnessed the murder itself. It is possible that Donald acted alone after staying in the house. Felicia mentioned that the 3 suspects had already faced consequences for their actions. Throughout the unsolved case, the entire neighborhood was convinced of their guilt, leading to negative treatment and repercussions. Sister Fawn stated that their lives had been essentially destroyed. Furthermore, it was revealed after the case was closed that the police had initially been informed about the suspects by one of their family members. The discovery of a Nintendo set-top box among his possessions by relatives triggered the recollection that it had been stolen from Fawn's house, The details were widely known in the neighborhood due to media coverage. Ultimately, proving their guilt was deemed impossible, and the victim's family now knows the identity of the killer, who lived unpunished for 17 years. Throughout that entire period, despite the circumstances, he maintained communication with his family. However, tragically, his dependence on illicit substances ultimately led to his demise, rendering him harmless to others. This is another difficult crime case solved. In the quiet suburban town of Cohasset, Massachusetts, a chilling crime shook the community to its core. On January 4th, 2023, the disappearance of Anna Walshy, a 39-year-old mother of 3 and successful real estate executive, was reported by her husband, Brian Walshy. What initially seemed like a missing persons case soon unraveled into a tangled web of deceit, betrayal, and murder. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a trail of evidence that pointed to a shocking suspect, Anna's own husband, Brian. The case that would come to be known as the Cohasset murder would reveal a complex and sinister plot, exposing the dark secrets lurking beneath the surface of a seemingly ordinary marriage. Anna Walshy was born in Belgrade, Serbia in 1983. She was raised in Belgrade, where she attended the 5th Belgrade Gymnasium and obtained a BA in French language and literature from the University of Belgrade. She emigrated to the United States in 2005, eventually becoming a dual citizen. She found work in the hospitality industry, including at the Inn at Little Washington. According to Boston 25 News, she is thought to have met Brian Walshy during her 2 years working at the Wheatley Hotel in Lenox, Massachusetts. She and Brian married in 2016, and she took his surname. They subsequently had 3 sons, who at the time of her disappearance were ages 2, 4, and 6. After working at several more hotels, Anna Walshy became a regional general manager at the real estate company Tishman Speyer in February 2022, splitting her time between her home with Brian in Cohasset, Massachusetts, and a residence in Washington, D.C., where she worked. On January 4th, 2023, Anna Walshy, a Serbian-American real estate executive, was reported missing by her employer and separately by her husband, Brian Walshy. Anna, who had residences in Cohasset, Massachusetts, and Washington, D.C., was last seen early on January 1st in Cohasset, having had dinner with Brian and a friend of his on New Year's Eve. After the Walshes and a friend of Brian's had dinner together on New Year's Eve 2022. In the first hours of 2023, Anna called her mother, sister, and maid of honor, all of whom were unavailable. She was last seen around 4 a.m. Brian says he spent the following day in Swampscott with his mother. On January 4th, both Tishman Speyer and Brian Walshy reported Anna missing. Brian told the police that Anna had left the house early for a flight from Boston's Logan International Airport to Washington, D.C., after a work emergency caused her to move up a trip scheduled for January 3rd. Police could not confirm whether she had gotten on a flight or gotten a ride to the airport. On January 1st, they found that while she had indeed previously booked a flight for January 3rd, she had not gotten on it, and that her credit and debit cards had not been used since January 1st. Brian Walshy was arrested on January and charged with misleading the police in the investigation into Anna's disappearance, after police could not find evidence that he had been to the CVS or Whole Foods in Swampscott on January 1st, as he had claimed. He pleaded not guilty. The prosecutor alleged that Brian had gone to Home Depot in Rockland, Massachusetts on January 2nd and spent $450 on cleaning supplies. Police received a search warrant for the Walshy residence and in the basement found blood and a damaged, bloody knife. On January 18th, Brian Walshy was arrested again and charged with murder and disinterring a body without authority. Prosecutors alleged that he beat her to death, dismembered her, and then disposed of the body. As evidence, they cited his Google search history on multiple devices, including his son's iPad, which they allege includes terms like how long before a body starts to smell, dismemberment, and the best ways to dispose of a body, and can you be charged with murder without a body? Brian pleaded not guilty. On March 30th, Brian was indicted on the charges of first-degree murder, misleading a police investigation, and improper conveyance of a human body. The event gained significant public attention in the United States and Serbia. Serbia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs has communicated through the Serbian Consulate General in New York with the Norfolk District Attorney's Office. In order to provide Anna Walshy's mother with non-publicly available information about the course of the investigation, Brian told the police that Anna had flown to D.C. for a work emergency. After an initial arrest on January 8th for misleading investigators regarding his whereabouts the day of the disappearance, Brian was charged on January 18th with murder and disinterring a body without authority, to which he pleaded not guilty. Prosecutors alleged that he beat her to death and dismembered and disposed of her body. In 2021, Brian pleaded guilty in federal court on 3 charges of fraud relating to selling counterfeit Andy Warhol works. At the time of Anna's disappearance, he was on house arrest awaiting sentencing.